Hey everybody, this is Beth Durinsky from Odyssey Insurance and Investments, and you're listening to the podcast, Real Insurance Made Simple. As a working mom of young kids and a small business owner, I know firsthand life happens. So come along with me and learn how your insurance policies work when real life happens and you need them most. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Real Insurance Made Simple. We are in the middle of our business mini-series on business insurance commercial policy packages, BOPs, otherwise known as a business owner's policy. And as I mentioned last week when we were going over the different parts of a business package or BOP policy, that this week we are going to touch on endorsements. Endorsements are additional coverages that you can add on to like a base policy. And I know I've said it before, and I just want to reiterate again, all policies in general may be about 10 feet wide, but they're all not going to be 10 feet deep. Some may be 20 feet deep. Some you may barely be able to wade in. Not all insurance policies are made the same, and the types of endorsements that you have added on to your policy will help indicate the types of added coverages or how deep your policy actually is. Let me also add that there is no way for me to include all of the endorsements that are out there across all of the different carriers. One of the carriers I work with in particular has probably quadruple the number of endorsements that I'm even going to touch on, if not more. There are tons out there. It is also very industry specific. What type of business do you have could indicate what type of endorsements you need. So today I am going to hit on a few of the popular ones and the major ones that are kind of more all-encompassing to several different types of businesses. Not necessarily guaranteed all businesses, but they're going to be prominent on a good portion of them. So let's start with some endorsements under the liability side. Again, the liability is for if you're found at fault for something you do as a business. The first one is going to be professional liability. A lot of times a standard business policy, depending on the type of business you have, can be endorsed for professional liability. We did touch base on this last week. This is your essentially errors and omissions, to best explain it, for the type of business you do. Maybe for a hairdresser, you really mess up someone's hair, or a mechanic, you don't properly install something or put a tire back on. These are forms of professional liability that don't typically fall under a general liability or the base portion of an insurance policy. Now, I know we're talking about endorsements, and there are carriers that will endorse a standard general liability policy for the professional liability. However, there are some instances, depending on the type of business and the type of work being done, where you cannot endorse your general liability policy with a professional liability, and it will have to be purchased separately on what's called a standalone policy. So it would be a separate policy on its own to cover your business for professional liability. The next endorsement is called Directors and Officers, or D&O coverage. This is more for like a board of directors and officers. So if you're on a nonprofit organization or something affiliated with a town or a local government, anything to do with a board of people who make a decision, that's where the D&O policies like to come in. And so if your nonprofit has a general liability policy, sometimes those can be endorsed with the D&O coverage. Again, that is just like the professional liability. It depends on what the nonprofit is, what they're doing. And if you cannot endorse the general liability, then the D&O can be purchased on its own as a standalone policy as well. The final endorsement that we're going to touch base on in regards to what falls under the liability is garage keeper's liability. And this is more for like the mechanic shops or the car lot. And this one is a good one to end the liability with before we bridge into the property coverage endorsements, because this one is sort of like a hybrid. It is a blend of commercial and auto as it relates to a customer's vehicle. The reason I say it is a hybrid is because it is technically a liability endorsement because you're protecting someone else and their items, but a lot of times you're protecting the physical property of someone else. So it's property coverage for someone else's vehicle because it is in your care, custody, and control. You are taking care of that vehicle. You have custody of it while it is in your shop and being repaired, and it is under your control, which can also include test drives. So you want to make sure if your business does take on vehicles of other people, that this may be a very pertinent thing to have added onto your policy. All right, as I'm reviewing my list here in front of me, there's actually one more endorsement under the liability side. But again, that kind of goes hand in hand with property. Is this one for one of my specific carriers is called voluntary property damage. It may be covered something else under a different carrier, but essentially this endorsement is for something that let me think. Okay, so if you're a painter in your job and you are insured for painting a room, you're not insured to like move furniture. But in order to properly paint a particular room, maybe you have to move some of the furniture out of the way. And in that moment, you actually drop and break some like a china cabinet or something that has some serious value to it. Your liability, if it is properly endorsed, will cover the property damage of voluntary work that you did that was not associated with the type of work that you were insured for. So again, a painter is not insured as a furniture mover, but he in turn moved the furniture in order to do the job. So it was voluntary property damage. Check with your agent on this to see how your policy is currently covered. All right, now we are moving on to property coverage endorsements. These are added endorsements that allow you as a business owner to help protect your business personal property, the items that it takes you to do your job every day, or your business property coverages like your storefront or your brick and mortar office. All right, let's start with equipment breakdown. This is when the equipment that you use on a daily basis for your business to be successful and to continue to operate experiences a sudden and accidental breakdown. This is not typically wear and tear and not typically old age. Sometimes we just have equipment that needs to be replaced and updated, and equipment breakdown is not for that. So a few examples. You have a power surge to the electrical panel, which caused your building to lose power. The refrigerator for your restaurant, or maybe even your walk-in cooler or your freezer that keeps all your products and your produce for cooking in that restaurant. And maybe it has like a sensor fail and it's no longer staying to temp and it ruins everything in the refrigerator or the walk-in. That would be an example of equipment breakdown. Or let's say you are a printing company or a newspaper company and your printing machine suddenly quits due to a mechanical failure. That is an example of equipment breakdown. Sometimes, depending on the company or the insurance carrier that you have equipment breakdown with, do require the piece of equipment to be reviewed and inspected to determine what the loss was before the equipment breakdown coverage extends to that piece of equipment. So something to keep in mind there, it's not a guaranteed or all-encompassing coverage. It has to be due to a covered loss deemed by the equipment breakdown company, the carrier providing the equipment breakdown coverage. On the flip side of things, let's look at an excavating company or business. The main piece of equipment for an excavating business would be an excavator. This is a piece of equipment that is on wheels and it is mobile. It moves from location to location. This is not going to be covered under equipment breakdown. This is just an example of a piece of equipment used for your business that the equipment breakdown coverage does not extend to. Next up on the list is going to be your inland marine coverage, and every carrier may call this a little bit differently. It may be name specific to the type of business you have, but in general, you're looking for coverage on equipment that goes with you to each job site. It does not stay at a brick and mortar store or at one location. For example, photographers and their camera equipment, or maybe contractors who take tools to their job site at each location. The important thing about this is making sure you have the accurate values of the tools and the equipment on hand. Decide how you want to schedule them on, or if you want to blanket that on to the policy. And then also be careful, because some carriers do give what's called an unattended vehicle exclusion, which means if the items are taken or harmed in an unattended vehicle, there's no coverage because it's an exclusion. It is excluded from the policy. So if you are traveling for your job and you are staying at a hotel and your tools are in an unattended vehicle, then if you have that exclusion, you may not be covered. Again, check with your agent, check with the specific insurance carrier that you have and how their specific policy and endorsement is written as it relates to this. Next, we also have what's called installation coverage. Again, this may be different for different carriers. It may be called something different, but this is essentially coverage for the materials that you take with you that need to be installed. If you're a plumber, you are going to have pipes and plumbing or toilets that you have to install in someone's home. These are materials that you need to do your job. They're not the tools that come and go with you. These are materials you're going to take to a job site to install at someone's home or place of business, and you're going to leave it there. You can have coverage for that separately as well. And you just want to make sure that you have enough coverage for the amount of equipment that you're taking with you to these different job sites. The next three endorsements that we are going to touch base on typically have to do with a brick and mortar location, physical location, office building specifically. For example, an endorsement that could be applied to your physical building is going to be ordinance or law. This coverage comes in when someone is covering their structure, and let's say their office building burns completely down, and they have $100,000 loan to rebuild. That's what it costs to rebuild their building. And they were previously grandfathered into maybe a local town ordinance that for commercial buildings that they did not have to have a sprinkler in their commercial building because they were grandfathered into that. But now that their building has burnt down and they have to rebuild, they are required to update and follow the local ordinances that they were previously grandfathered into. So maybe that is adding a sprinkler system. Maybe all commercially zoned buildings that are being rebuilt are required to have sprinklers installed. This would be an additional coverage in addition to the $100,000 limit to rebuild the building in order to get that sprinkler installed and keep up with your local ordinances or your local laws to meet the building codes. So that's just an add-on for the structure and the building itself. Another one would be earthquake. Just like with homes, earthquake coverage is not a default for businesses, and neither is flood coverage. If these are something that concern you or you want to have protection against in the event of a loss with an S. Words are hard today, I apologize. But if these are things you want to have coverage for in the event of a loss, then these are things that you need to have endorsed on your business policy. Another one is going to be water backup. Before I get into water backup, let me start by explaining there are three different types of losses that can occur due to water. The first one is going to be your standard water, a pipe breaking inside the building. It bursts. That's typically covered under your base coverage for the structure. Then there is flood, which is typically excluded, and you need to add flood coverage or buy a separate flood policy. And then the third is going to be water backup. This happens a lot in buildings that are below ground that maybe has sub pumps. And if there's a storm that comes through and causes the electric to go out and maybe the backup generator isn't working on the sub pump, the water then backs up to the building and damages the interior of the building. That would be water backup. This is another way that the building coverages can be endorsed to better protect you. And another way that just because you have $100,000 of coverage on your business building doesn't mean you're covered for anything that happens to that building. So something else to keep in mind. The final two endorsements that we're going to touch on really protect the business side of things more on a fraudulent level. So they're not necessarily a liability coverage in that it protects someone else, although it kind of is, and they're not a property coverage. But that is going to be a form of cyber coverage. And cyber coverage has two parts. It's going to be first-party coverages, which protect you as the business owner, or third-party coverages, which is where the liability comes in and protects someone else that may choose to file suit against you. The first-party coverages for you as the business owner or just the business in general is going to be a data breach response. So if your data is physically breached and you have expenses that incur due to responding to that, a direct computer attack to your computer systems, cyber extortion, where we are seeing those pop-ups happen where they lock down your computer and they say, in order to access your information, you have to pay us X amount of dollars or we're keeping you locked out. It also provides coverage for misdirected payment fraud, computer fraud, or telecommunications fraud. On the third-party coverages, which is where the liability kicks in, it's essentially coverage for defense and settlement costs in the event of a suit related to privacy incident. So like a breach in someone else's personal information, a network liability, so a system security failure on your part, or a electronic liability where a client's information is displayed on your website. So the cyber coverages that I'm most familiar with provide these coverages on a first and third party basis. This may be called something differently with each carrier. For example, one of the main carriers I work with, it's called Cyber Suite. Every carrier could have a different combination of these. Just something to keep in mind that the coverage is out there to be purchased. In addition, they do encourage identity recovery to be wrapped in with the cyber coverages just to make sure you're fully covered on that front, just to help you better respond to theft as a business owner or like if fraudulent charges occur on a business line of credit. So that's another endorsement known as identity recovery that can be added on to a commercial package policy or a business owner's policy. So that was just a quick summary of a few of the different endorsements that you can purchase to add on to a commercial business policy, whether it's called a commercial package, a business owner's policy. There's a variation of names. I wanted to bring some of these different options to you guys as a way to show you that if you don't have some of these endorsements and you just have your base liability policy, I would go back to the previous episodes and understand what just a general liability policy is going to cover. Because a lot of people tend to think, oh, I have insurance, so I'm just covered for whatever I do on behalf of the business. And that is not always the case. And these endorsements are just scratching the surface on the type of endorsements that you could purchase or you may need to fully protect your business. And the type of endorsements that you may need are dependent on the type of business that you are running and operating. The purpose of insurance is to mitigate your risk. And that only can happen when you have a true sit down with an agent, review what your risks are, what potential exposures that you may have, and how you want to pay to mitigate those risks. Maybe you determine the cost of that endorsement or the cost of that coverage is not worth the mitigation that it's providing, and you're willing to cover that cost on your own in the event that happens. Only you as the business owner can decide that. We as agents can only provide you the information and fully educate you on what is out there and the gaps in coverage that you have. Again, I want to reiterate that not all policies are made equal. Cheap may not always mean better at the time of a loss. You want to make sure you understand what you are purchasing, and just because you have insurance does not mean you are automatically covered. Have a conversation with an agent. Be open and honest with them, and let them know how you want your insurance policy to work for you. That will really allow your insurance agent to help tailor a policy that you are comfortable with and that provides the coverages that you want and how you expect your insurance policy to work. Again, we are happy to help you complete that insurance review. If you do not have an insurance agent that you are working with, please feel free to give us a call at 812-932-2200. Have a blessed day, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thank you all for listening today. We hope you found this episode helpful and informative as you navigate the world of insurance. As a reminder, this podcast is never for legal or professional advice, and you should always consult your local and licensed insurance professional. We wish you a week filled with love and blessings from the team at Odyssey Insurance and Investments.